Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Happy New Year. Great to be here. Peter, how's it going?
Well, I am excited. I have my off day today, which I don't not earned, but I had a good solid week. I am tired, sore in many ways, and it is a lovely snowing day outside where I'm looking over my computer screen and I see this. It's like a screensaver of falling snow on a nice day where you just want to curl up beside the fireplace. So things are going well in Peterville.
All right.
I just came up with that on the fly.
Over in Molly land, I'm a little less excited about the snow, we'll put it that way, although I also have a rest day today after also a good week of training.
Yes, you were flying. You did a 5K PB.
Yes, at the end of a 16-mile run, so that was definitely an exciting thing. And actually, it's something that I want to talk about. I'm going to hold off on it because I think it actually...
Well, I think it's topical today.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I'm curious if your watch said anything to you.
My watch told me I was detraining. My watch thinks
great.
I suck.
Well, that's a teaser of what we're talking about today. We are talking about a variety of metrics because some people have gotten new watches for Christmas. It is the new year. People have gone indoors. So we thought that maybe we'd run through some of the common things your watches and your devices and your online programs might tell you and what they mean. Not that they're all bad, but what they might mean and then what to do with them. That's really sort of the name of the game today.
Yes. And I mean, I'll say this as a person who really doesn't use a lot of gear. I've done stuff for Canadian Cycling Magazine, kind of all about wearables and what to be wary of, what to look for. I think they have a ton of positives. I, really like the concept of HRV. I know for me, I'm not really a great wearable wearer, but I know... I was
going to say, we should say you have used
I've used
many,
all of
if not most. You can't say most these days because there's so many, but you've used a lot, all the rings and the watches and the devices. But you personally, when you exercise, when you train, you sort of just go out the door and do it. And you do have a coach, but these are some intervals you're doing today, and you might run vigorously for a period or for a certain distance. So you track distance, but it's yourself. You seem to end up back at the basics, I guess. Yeah,
exactly. But what I was going to say is every year, right around this time, I get the urge to put back on one of the wearables. I actually brought my Oura ring down when, we're down at my parents in New Jersey from Ontario. But you just
got so many rings from your husband for Christmas that...
I did not get any rings from my husband for Christmas.
Well, you had the one, I guess.
I have the one.
Okay.
I got lovely presents from you for Christmas. You did great. But anyway, all that to say, I get sucked back into the idea of wearing this stuff. I've talked about it on here. I've been, I think, pretty open about the fact that I just get very caught up in numbers. If I look at them, if I start recording them, I get a little obsessive about them. That's why I don't do, I think I talked about it last week with our episode with Kylie and Zoe, which if you didn't listen to, go back and listen to. Awesome one about sort of this new year, new you resolution setting, especially as it pertains to diet. We talked about food logging, and for me, food logging always ends up a race to the bottom. How low can your calorie count be? And it's not even purposeful. I'm aware that I'm doing, I'm so aware that it's a thing I do, and I still can't help myself from doing it. It's, I think, a thing that a lot of millennial women who grew up with this diet culture and knowing exactly how many calories
I said to Master's Man, 50 years old, I said, you can track the calories, I guess, but I think probably you need to go and talk to an RD or a therapist in some cases, because they come, as many of us do, from the, starve yourself to try and get skinny era of athletics. And it's, I think, embedded for a lot of us that this calories and skinny.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So even though we cannot stress how many times we've had someone on to talk about the fact that that's not an accurate equation. Still just. But
I think it's maybe one that's close to home for people where it's, we have this complex problem of life, but let's narrow it down to the sport as what is that, an analogy for life? What is that,
My least favorite thing in the entire universe. You want to start a business?
Marathon,
let's talk about running a marathon.
So if we use sport, cycling, running, whatever you're into, it's very complex, performance, especially on a day, showing up, competing against other people, who gets to start, who gets the finish line. It's very complex, right? You can't just say calories, but that's what the human brain always wants to simplify to these, rules of thumb, heuristics, single metrics. We call this the metric to rule them all. And we have a post about DW's pants and the Gollum ring from Lord of the Rings. You choose whichever analogy you like, but our little dachshund loves pants and it smells like us, I guess. So, he like holds on to them and gets ridiculous with it, but then forgets all the other things he has to do in life as a little wiener dog, right? He's supposed to do a variety of things and none really involve pants, but he gets like obsessive until you take the pants away and then it's like a snap. And it's very much, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, there's Gollum or Smeagol, depending on the status, and he gets obsessed.
The status?
Well, the ring status. Does he have it or not? And so he gets obsessed with it, right? And just like this ring, and it's like his whole life, like, it ruins them. And that's, it's extreme to think about it that way, but I do think it's a great thing to remember when you're like calories or like FTP or
TSS or stress score, readiness score.
They're all models for that complex system, and they cannot possibly account for everything that goes into a mountain bike race or whatever the thing is you're getting ready for. They can't account for like the complexity that a human is, right? So HRV, while it's very popular and I do like it, it can't possibly know anything really, right? When you think about what it is, it's like, in a lot of cases, a light shining into your wrist that's supposed to encompass all that you are as a person and your worth, right? If it goes up, you're a great person. And that, if you think about that, it's not possibly true, right? So I think that's the overarching thing as we go through the individual metrics today, is just to keep asking, like, what are the factors? What's important in this? What can this inform? Is it worthwhile? Is it valid? These are sort of the questions that we'll have to go through.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, also remembering a lot, like all of these devices have such a large range of error or chance of error.
Well, not large, but there is one. I think you need to acknowledge that for sure. And then you would ask, like, how much?
Well, I'm going to say large because to me, you're also talking about like your human error with them. Like you took off the watch for a couple days, or in my case, I turned the heart rate off on the Garmin to do Leadville because I wanted the battery to last longer and I haven't turned it back on.
Sure.
As a result, the Garmin thinks I'm dead. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I've been detraining for 6 months.
Yeah.
Or you take you take it off to charge and you forget to wear it one night. So now the data is skewed because of that. When we were experimenting with the CGM a couple of years ago for this article that I mentioned, we wrecked like 2 of them, like the sensors, because we didn't put them on you right or on me right. So they were collecting inaccurate data.
So, I mean, in an ideal world, they still have a margin of error. And this is true of power meters. I remind people, every power meter will tell you, like, I think the best is like 1% for SRM. I think, I'm sorry to SRM if it's better than 1% plus minus, but there's even a percent. So how many times have any of us started like crying because our power is, what would that be? What's 1%, right? Like
3?
Yeah, it's 190 instead of 200 and we're crying. But like how much of that, like, potentially there's a margin of error of at least a few watts in that scenario. But then, what's the variability in a human day to day, right? So, but then we're in tears because we've gotten worse apparently in a day. But then meanwhile, it could easily be the margin of error that's in any of these data collection technologies that we use.
Yeah. And I mean, ditto, trainer versus outdoors. You have such a huge range of inputs coming in. And that's another reason we wanted to do this episode too, is we know a lot of people are in on the trainer now, and that you were actually talking about this. You started using the Training Peaks virtual platform. You really like it, but
great.
you were, and you were saying you like it because you realize it's actually better for you to see distance on it versus when you've just used...
Let's hold up, because I did say in a podcast just recently that I thought the virtual distance was sort of dumb.
But okay, let me just finish my thought.
Okay, just let's be clear. I didn't say I liked the distance. I said that it was nice to have another metric there, such as the virtual distance.
Yeah, because otherwise you start focusing entirely on the watts, the heart rate, like which are things you wouldn't normally focus on outside because you're trying to, not get hit by cars or like follow the trail.
You speak for yourself. I stare at my Garmin.
Yeah.
It'll alert me when there's a car behind me.
There you go. Anyway, all that to say, when you're indoors on the trainer, it's a lot easier to get fixated on some of these numbers because you don't have all of the outdoor inputs coming at you.
Of course, yeah.
And you actually liked getting into this virtual world because it gave you at least something else to focus on that wasn't just those numbers.
Sure. Yeah. I always try and encourage, it seems like no one really uses these virtual environments just to go for a ride. And that's really...
that's the only thing I've been doing.
I wish there was more, options to turn left and turn right, or, to find different things. And I'm sure there's a bit of this.
You just want Pokemon Go to like get integrated.
I guess
one of these.
I will say, I don't want it to be a game per se, but something where, like when
I get points for finding things.
No, but I think the more, especially if it was a real map where it's almost like, overlaid over Google Maps or something, and you can ride from here to there, right? And you sort of navigate, and perhaps that could be gamified where you're trying to find like more of a direct route or something like that. But to me, that's the most useful. But then you'll see people trying, always loading workouts and just like hurting so much. And it's like, no, just go for a bike ride like you do outside and let it be variable. The nice thing about the indoors is you can still pedal even on these like mountain descents. It's great, right? You'd still sort of pedal. It's a little bit of a break, but you don't have to sit there and coast. But in any case, that's getting a little deep on that stuff.
Well, I think, the last thing I'm going to say before we get into the Training Peaks metrics we want to talk about is you have a note here about, kind of the happy runner concept. And shout out to David and Megan Roche, our good friends, fantastic coaches. Their book, The Happy Runner, is a great read. But even just backing out, like the concept of just being a happy athlete when you're out there, like, we just talked about, I set my like 5K PB from the last couple of years this weekend, just, tail end of a 16-mile trail run. And it wasn't because I was looking at my watch. It actually happened entirely accidentally. It was because I was listening to a really good playlist, and I haven't listened to music on the run in months. And I was just in a really good mood, and just like, I was literally like dancing through it. It was... luckily Peter came up behind me, because if he'd came in like up in front of me, he would have seen me like lip syncing along with the Cranberries. It was not cool. But I was very happy, and that's what worked.
Yeah, and I think that you need to remember your why, right? And we always talk about this nebulous why, but it is, unlikely that FTP or TSS or fitness score or any of these things are the reason you got into it, calories or whatever, right? There has to be like something else beyond that, and that might take exploration, but, it can't be strictly to eat the least amount of calories. At some point there isn't much of a why there. And again, with the FTP stuff, like if you look at what it is supposed to be, people think it needs to go up all the time and be maintained all the time, but that is not what that is, right? It should undulate across the season, right? That is the idea. On the same page, people will talk about peaking, and it's like, well, to peak it has to go down on both sides of it. That is the definition, right? Like that's the idea. And even if you're not racing or really peaking or tapering, that would be the idea. So I think you always need to reflect on why you're doing the thing, and then backing out again what these metrics might be, when we do want to start paying attention to things. The interesting thing with you talking about a 5K is it also would suggest that you don't often throw down flat 5K
Oh, there
TTs.
is 100% that, yeah.
So again, like, it's interesting. That's great. I think that you could run fast, but you also don't do 5K races.
No, and to be clear, this was not like a smoking 5K.
And most of your intervals would be uphill or like on off-road terrain, I would imagine, that are longer like that, right? Anytime you have 20 minutes, moderate, or it's often like uphill, I think, or at least off-road.
Yeah, and honestly, rarely do I have like moderate 20. Yeah, it's moderate 20 minutes, but I'm almost always
David's
doing
not
it.
Big on longer intervals usually.
Yeah, exactly. Like that'd be the longest, and usually I'm doing that on undulating terrain. This just happened to be I was on a rail trail for a few miles at the end.
Mm-hmm. So I think that I only point that out not to disparage your
Oh no, it was not
again. I like it because it was like mostly an endurance pace type thing. So it is a good indicator. It is nice to feel quick on your run. Like you could run at the end of a long run, and towards the end of the week is great. However, it does point out that, while your watch might pop up and say fastest 5K, congratulations, Molly, and then have like, confetti.
To be clear, my watch was like, you're detrained, you suck.
Did it not point out that you had a faster 5K or something?
No, my Strava had to point that out.
Okay. But even Strava would be another example of like, it's celebration, which is great. You should celebrate by all means. But there is this context that you just had a tailwind, or you had a flat thing, or something happened that was outside of you. It's external. And again, this is the tricky thing, is like, do you celebrate this? Yes, I think it's great. But at the same time, you know, you can see how this could be misleading, where you get this PB or this other thing, and it's, you know, not necessarily because of any change in your physiology per se.
Oh no, it was strictly just I was in a good mood. Like, and honestly, like, I didn't even, we got it when we got in the car. I told you, I thought I had
quite ecstatic.
I told you I thought I had a fast 5K, but it was more that I was just like in a really good mood. Like, I hadn't actually checked what that 5K was,
which is almost the celebration that you were able to go and run for a distance and be really exuberant and feel great and fresh. And, you know, that's, you know, to me, we're celebrating. That is the happy runner. What I take from that book that you referenced is that we're celebrating much more than any of the paces or the wattages or whatever you're pulling out of that, right? And it's like, well, how do we make that metric, that enjoyment metric, worthwhile and equal, right? And the feeling of the run, the completion of the run, you know, the fueling on the run. Did you, yes or no? You know, these are some of the other things we can look at that aren't necessarily in a wearable.
Okay, but assuming you are, in fact, tracking your stuff, and, you know, for a lot, like all of Peter's coaching clients, you're working in Training Peaks, which is really just a software that provides a calendar.
Two-way calendar,
Yeah, so it shows you what workout you have or what training you have that day, and then you can upload from your device directly into Training Peaks. If you don't have this set up on auto, please pause us right now and set it up to auto upload, even if you're not using Training Peaks, actually. Free app, just set your stuff to auto upload now. That way, if you do decide you want to train for something and work with a coach, you have all of this stuff saved, just because Strava is a closed system where you can't get any of that stuff out.
For sure. And so we do recommend a lot of the younger athletes or people who just aren't very serious. It is a great place to store data because it is easier to export or do stuff with it eventually, whether you get a coach or not. And it is you can get a free basic account and you know, turn off all the emails, and you never will get noticed of it. But yeah, you can send to it from your Garmin Connect, so then it's in a second place while still sending to Strava or whatever else you use. But yeah, that's definitely a good piece of advice. Okay,
but once you are in there are some metrics that just kind of come up. So we wanted to just kind of talk through them. And again, if you have any specific questions about them, definitely hit us up with questions, consummateathlete.com. We have a contact form, or just DM us on Instagram at consummateathlete. But do you want to start with just the fitness score, also known as the chronic training load, or CTL?
Sure. One of our most popular posts is what is fitness score, I think, or something to that effect. So you will be presented with this in Training Peaks, and you'll see this same model, this load model in Strava, in I imagine Zwift does it too. I'm not sure, but you know, a lot of these things will present you with this fitness score, is what they call it, but it's really just a chronic, or a, you know, say 6 week, 4 week load metric. So it's saying over the last 4 weeks, this is how much you've trained on average for today, like a day, right? Like on average each day, this is how much you train. So if you trained 1 hour every day at sort of an easy pace, you might end up around like 30 to 50 TSS per day would be what it would give you, right? After you've trained for 6 weeks or longer, that would be roughly. Now, you wouldn't train exactly like that. You'd take a rest day, you'd do a long day, you'd have some hard days, but a lot of people will end up in that sort of 30 to 70 when they're sort of full-time working adults. And all that's, again, saying is that that's the average TSS points, if you will, for the day, and that's load. So I try and pull people away from that's your fitness to that's the load that you're carrying, depending on how you're recording that. And the important thing is that load requires a duration, and then it also requires an intensity, which usually is pulled off of power in sort of like the ideal model, but it can be pulled off of pace, or it can be pulled off of heart rate as well. And it's just comparing the average heart rate, or the normalized, we won't get into that, but like sort of an average heart rate for the workout or power, and it's comparing that to your threshold value for heart rate or for power as well, or pace.
Okay, and now where does either cross training, say without a device, or strength training come into that?
They're good questions. Again, the model is happiest. The best person to use this is like a indoor cyclist or a road cyclist who's collecting power every single day and doesn't really strength train and doesn't really do anything cross training wise. Not because those people are better, just because they're putting all of their training time into the model in a nice sort of clean fashion that doesn't have a lot of other variables to it. Even still, there would be variables, but that would be the ideal. So you can collect heart rate TSS and pace-based TSS, and there's all these models for all these other things, but it does get a little clunky to look at the model, and you'd have to, your margins for error become much bigger once you start feeding in all these different sources. Now, that said, I always assume that it's probably still worth something when we're comparing to ourselves in past months and past years. Some of the people I work with have 10 plus years of doing sort of the same thing. They'll run a little bit, they'll ride a little bit, they'll do strength a little bit. And so you start seeing the same trend, even if it is a little messy with power and heart rate all combined into one. But that's roughly the idea with that. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, ideally you'd sort of like do the one thing. And again, this is where the model just gets tricky to use when it's across a bunch of different things. I will add just one other thing. The strength training, I usually recommend not tracking heart rate during strength, so then it wouldn't go into this model because it's not load. You might just have a duration or just that you did the strength training workout. And then yes, of course, you're going to be tired. And yes, of course, that's going to contribute to your quote unquote fitness by doing strength training. But because the strength, like if you've ever done like a heavy set of squats and then been tired for a week, but it took you like, a minute to do those squats, maybe, right? Like, I think everyone understands that you could do something in the gym in a short period of time that just ruins you for a week. Whereas on a bicycle, one sprint or something, or one minute effort generally is not going to knacker someone for a week. So generally I would not put that in. Now, some people do track heart rate and just put it in as a load, and it probably works out okay in the end, assuming they're consistent with it. But I usually suggest just tracking the time and not having a training load come out of the strength training.
Yeah, and I mainly was asked that to kind of just point to the fact that this metric, again, there's so much nuance to it. There's so much, you don't even want to call it room for error, but like,
I think it's room for error.
It's room for error, yeah.
And so we wanted to do sort of like a what, so what, and then now what, when we're going through this, and sort of to explain it. So, I mean, the so what is that this is going to give you an idea of like last year you got to say 50, and that was like the peak of that load, the highest load you held for a period of time in, say, your off-season base phase when you were accumulating fitness. Maybe you got to like into the 50s, and then you sort of stopped racing, or you started racing even, and it leveled off and even tailed off towards the fall, and then you took some time off, and maybe it goes down to say 20. You do the odd couple easy sort of rides, runs, whatever. It goes down to 20, and then you build back up for the next year. And that wave pattern, or I call them mountains, these mountains of your season are every year. And so what you might do on an individual level, I wouldn't do this between people, but if Molly last year, she did Leadville and she got up to like 110 TSS average per day because she was running a ton, just tons and tons of miles because she was doing a 100-mile race. And then this year she's going to do more 100-milers. Then what we might look at is, can you build up to that similar amount of load? You might not go to more because you were in great shape and did well with it, but that might give you an idea of what type of load you'd want to carry by a certain point before your race or for your race, right? And then on the flip side, what it lets you do as you peak, and this is sort of like the other thing people will do, is you'll look at the balance when you're tapering, you're backing off the training in those last, days or weeks before the training. Then you see this balance where the weekly training versus the chronic training, so that's this week versus the 6 weeks, you start seeing that those become about equal or even a little less, so that then your recovery improves, right? And there's a couple of metrics associated with that CTL and fitness score called TSB and ATL, not to add a lot of lines to this, but that sort of lets you see, like, am I recovering for the race day? So in that last week before, have you backed off enough to have your recovery increase? And so that chart, that performance manager chart, or the TSS chart, or the fitness score chart, it can help you decide and guide that taper as well. So I would say those are sort of the two main values I see in it, is sort of like, when we've seen you in good shape, what was that peak load, not fitness, but the load that you carried for you, not for me, compared to you, but just for you. And then also when you're coming into that taper, how much do you like to taper down? What is that? And there's a couple numbers there that can help with that as well.
So it doesn't define my value as a human being.
No, and it's very like, year to year, you'll see differences. It doesn't always mean that you get to that same level. Like Leadville might be the highest load you ever carry. Like that could be possible, right? And it doesn't mean that you will perform worse. And that's the disconnect often, is that people think, I got to 100 last year, I need to get 100 or else I will never do as well. And those are not the same thing. There's a correlation there. The more you train, generally, the fitter you're going to be. But of course, there's a whole question of, how did you train to get to that 100? We don't know. All we know is that it's intensity times time. So we don't know if you were more intense or was it lots of volume. There's a mix there, but that mix can change. So we don't know how you made that volume. And then also there can be lots of other variables, right? You've also now trained for another year. So there's all the other aspects that go into performance. Racing certainly, but even going and doing a test of some type, like the classic 20-minute test, there's a whole bunch of experience and structural adaptations that happen to the body over years. So the fact that you trained successfully for a year, your heart adapted, you have more vascular networks across your body. There's all sorts of things that happen that take a long time to develop and a long time to erode. So even if you trained a little less in this coming year, you could perform better. Speaking specifically to Molly's case here, but true of all of us, we all trained this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, love it. Do you want to talk about specifically FTP VO2, or do you want to talk about power profiles first?
Do you want to do power profiles?
That's what's on our list.
Okay. I wasn't going to mention those, but we can. Also in Training Peaks, there's if you go to the dashboard, but you could see these anywhere. It's essentially laying out your 5-second power, your 1-minute power, your 5-minute power, and your 20-minute power. And there's probably variations on this, but that's what's usually in Training Peaks. And usually it's done power to weight. And historically, it would lay out, you're like a Cat 5, a Cat 4, a Cat 3, a Cat 2, you're pro, you're domestic pro, you're a UCI, whatever pro. They've sort of gotten away from that a little bit, I think, but it sort of gives you an idea for each of those powers, where do you rank, right? We've all seen, these top Pro Tour pros do, 6 watts per kg for 20 minutes or 7 watts per kg, what they're doing now, or something like that. And that's,
or so it's more based on how all the different powers are like together. It gives you you're a domestic climber.
For each one, they rank them separately.
Oh, I thought it used to be that they ranked them together and told you what you should be. Like if you had like an amazing,
you can transform all this numbers as much as you want. I guess you could take an average.
Yeah, where it was stuff like if you had like an amazing like 5-second and like 1 second, but like kind of a crap 20-minute or a medium 20-minute, it would be like you're a domestic sprinter. Like you're not going to be great on the climbs, but like
maybe they've put them together like that. There is, the profile though would give you that information where you're like a time trialist or you're a sprinter. Your sprinter would have the 5-second, whatever. And then your time trialist would have like a really good 20. And then there's some in the middle as well. So yeah, there's definitely those as well. Those are called phenotypes, as I recall. But that chart,
that's what I'm thinking
that
of. Peak
profile, what's the utility there? So it might tell you where you haven't done any work, and this is power as well, right? You need to have power for this. And so someone who trains only indoors, usually you won't see much on the 5-second or the 1 minute. It could be because you don't do those intervals, but also because those are harder to really like do a max out job on indoors, right? When you think about sprinting, you think about someone moving the bike side to side, really going fast outside, maybe up a hill or something like that. The 5 and the 20 are maybe easier for a lot of people to do indoors, partially because it's hard to find terrain for a lot of people where they have a good, safe, 5-minute and 20-minute stretch, perhaps a hill to do. So a lot of people will have pretty good 20s indoors. Mine is not as good. For whatever reason, I don't ride indoors, which is also common, that you don't ride, quite as high power indoors. But again, there can be safety and terrain considerations there. But what do you do with this? So that's what it is. It's the peak profile. So you can look at yours and you can say, okay, well, am I well suited to the events I'm doing? So if you're doing cyclocross and you have really poor 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, that might not be as good a match. If you're doing time trials and you have a very low 20 and 60 type thing, then you might find that, you would do better in another event. Or it might just be, it could guide your training again because you haven't done it. That's the thing you don't know, is like the model only knows the data you've put into it, which is a good thing to remember with all of these, is that it only knows the data that you gave it. But that's sometimes like an interesting one to look at. And of course, I'd rather see that one like over the course of like years even, because then you start collecting more and more information and more data, right, where you can see like many iterations of that, and you can sort of see like an average of the 5 minute across time, not just one 5 minute, which I guess is another concept, that you sort of want these clusters of data where you've done many 5 minute efforts over the months and years. And then, so even your 5K example, you could do this with a runner. I don't really care about your one time, like the stars aligned and it was a tailwind and you did a 5K this fast. I'd love to see your 5 best 5Ks in 2024. And then you'd have a better idea of like who that person is, right? If you were predicting data. So this is where even when athletes will get spun out about like one 20-minute test or one whatever, it just is irrelevant until you've collected. This is our complete before you compete. You could apply this to testing and efforts and intervals, right? Like get through 1 or like 10, and then, then you can talk about it. I don't know if it was a Dan John thing, but like, you don't deserve to be mad about this is something to that effect, right? Like you just go and do it, right? Like there's nothing to be mad about because you're learning, right? And just like enjoy the learning process.
I love it. Okay, are there any other Training Peaks numbers that you want to get into before we touch on some Garmin?
Well, we didn't do threshold, did we?
No.
Okay.
Did you want to?
Well, do we have the definition? I think I wrote it out there. It's good to have like the actual one.
Yeah. So FTP, if you're, new to cycling.
So this is the functional threshold power. So we're not going to get into all the iterations of possible thresholds and physiological things. This is just the Training Peaks FTP.
Okay. So definition is the highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatigue.
Okay. And it's always like a tricky one because it's like, well, what does fatigue? I think fatigue in this case, you're going to be tired, but it's like you're not going to fade, I think is like what that means. That's what I take it to mean because I tend to be very tired after a 1 hour time trial. But indeed, this used to be, the 40K TT, the 1 hour TT. I believe now with the updated, WKO definitions that they're using, that you'll see a range for that time to exhaustion, or the time that the FTP lasts, somewhere between sort of 36, 40 minutes up to about 70 minutes in some cases as well, right? And again, this might be a hint, if you can look at this duration and sort of learn about that might be something where you start, being like, I'm someone who's good at this type of event versus another one of, a time trialist, or, probably an even more extreme example was someone who's doing like a very long gravel event or something like that would want like to be able to do a higher percentage of this threshold for a longer period. And then, someone like a cyclocrosser, probably would want more on the quality side where they have like, more like a 20-minute, but then it drops off type thing.
Sure. So we mentioned FTP because it is one of the metrics that I think most cyclists know about and get utterly obsessed with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even that hour, you said, it's around an hour, but no one really does hour time trials, right? It's pretty tough to do that. Most people aren't willing to do it.
No, so most people will do the 20-minute test, and I think what a lot of people forget about the 20-minute test is it's like 90% of your 20-minute.
I think 95 is what they do, but I think 90 would probably be safer for a lot of people. Because I tend to have like pretty good VO2 5-minute type power. That's always the criticism, is like it can be quote unquote anaerobic or above threshold for a lot of it for people who are good at that, right? So that is sort of the tricky part with it, is that it can be misleading, and we want it to be a conservative number because it does set the zones
so this is not like a number that just exists. It's not like TSS or CTL or fitness that kind of exists over here as maybe informational but doesn't actually change your training. FTP actually genuinely will train or change every single workout you do, depending on how you have it set.
Well, and to be clear, like it affects those other numbers you just talked about and that we just spoke about here, that all those like performance manager chart load metrics, the load is based on the FTP when we're talking about power, and the heart rate associated with that if we're talking about heart rate. Those load metrics, how intense was this ride, come off of the setting that you have for these threshold values. So you do want it to be accurate, but also not ambitious, because as you said, for today's workout, say you go in and you're going to do 3 by 10 minutes, sort of threshold or moderate intervals. That is moderate because it's below the threshold, the functional threshold in this case, right? So if you have it set too ambitious, too high, then your intervals are not going to be moderate anymore. They're going to become hard, and indeed you may fail. So a good sign that you have your threshold wrong or too high is that you can't complete, like it's just really, really hard to get through a workout. Most workouts should not be so hard. You should almost have like a rep or 2 or 3 in reserve, which is very hard for someone who's motivated coming into the new year to realize that, you don't want to be on the limit very often at all, right? We always say 80% is a passing grade. And that refers both to like how perfect the workout needs to be, the letter, but also the intensity. I think, when we have athletes do something like the 20-minute test, a lot of times we do the 8 out of 10 test, which means just ease into it. Be super confident for the first 10, 15 minutes. And if by the end you're like pretty keen in the last 5, then you can ramp it up. That's not a perfect, because it's not really like steady state. But what that does is that we finish our test and we find out usually in the last 5 minutes that the 8 out of 10 pace was pretty on track for most people, right? Not to say that we never do like a max 20-minute, but that comes after much practice where you refine what you can hold in a quasi steady state for 20 minutes. So hopefully that establishes, this is a longer duration, pretty hard, but largely moderate effort that you can hold for an extended period of time. We don't want to be ambitious setting it, but it is important to set it in a way that lets you complete your workouts. And so if you're finding it hard to complete your workouts, I would set it lower. And you can always bump up these ranges and targets that you're going to see in these programs that you're using.
Love it. Okay. Next one I have on here is VO2 and MAP metrics. So that's MAP, not MAP like Google Maps.
So VO2, is something that's like the maximum oxygen consumption. Usually it's expressed in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram. So it's relative to your body weight, right? So that you could do it absolute and not have it relative to your body weight, but smaller people will have less air moving in and out of them than a bigger person, right? So they normalize it or make it relative to body weight. So that's usually what you'll see. You'll see Pogačar's VO2 is 80 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram.
I think it's like 87 or something.
Right. So usually that's what you'll see is like quite fit people are in the 70s, 80s. I mean, it seems like everything's just...
Okay, when you say quite fit, he means world tour level are in the 70s and 80s.
For the most part. I mean, but you can see a huge variation. Like I'm always in the 70s. I'm not world class.
You're in the low 70s.
Hey.
Like you just said it like, oh yeah, this guy that's like jogging down the road is like 85. The highest recorded ever is 97. Most people fall into the range of like 20 to 40. Like that's your average human.
Right. Not training. Yeah.
I'd say if you're not training, 20 to 30 is probably. I've been doing a lot of like looking into this lately. Garmin has some really good charts of it because Garmin watches, assuming you have heart rate turned on and like wrist-based, it will try, or you have a heart rate strap, it will try to estimate your VO2.
And GPS, yeah.
Yeah. Where was I going with that? Oh, so 70s and 80s mean you're pretty world class.
Sure.
Like, I'm sorry, you're a world class cyclist.
I don't know about I was pretty good. But all I say is like there's a bit of range. The example always thrown out is that it is specific to the sport. So you need to be careful. Like I would not probably get that high running. And the example always held out is Lance Armstrong, whatever, was cycling. But then did the marathon and he didn't get, I don't think, or maybe he just got under 3 hours, which is not a remarkable marathon for a world-class person. It's actually an hour behind a world-class person, right? So it's 50% behind what the best people, 50%, despite his VO2 max being, his was in the 80s as well, I believe, right? So it is a little specific to the sport. So we do need to be careful with that too when we're doing these maximal values. So that's even in the testing, you can have variables where if in a lab they tested someone in a different, you tested a cyclist as a runner, then you would see some differences there as well. But that is the idea. Often you'll see cross-country skiers have the highest values, which we always find interesting because they cross-train a lot. They use a lot of their muscle mass. So that's that. So the important bit there is that to measure that, you usually have an uncomfortable mask model. I just did this a few months ago, I guess now, where you wear a mask and they track the gases, what you're breathing, what you're expiring. This is carbon dioxide and oxygen. And so that would be how you measure VO2. And these values. Now, the watches, the wearables, will present you with your quote-unquote VO2, but you must remember that this is an estimation, which our friend over at HRV for Training, Marco Altini, talks a lot about these measurements versus estimations. And so you should really follow Marco on Substack. I'll put that in the show notes. But he talks a lot about all things HRV and has done I think 2 PhDs at this point on machine learning, and estimating VO2 max actually is like what his first degree I think was in. So again, the watch is estimating this based on how fast you're moving, perhaps power, perhaps GPS, and then the heart rate, and it's trying to correspond these values. And it actually is surprisingly good at estimating, but there are obviously lots of variables there, such as, are you running on variable terrain? Have you maxed out? Have you trained, is the GPS signal valid? There's all sorts of things that could affect that estimation.
Yeah, and actually I'll have an article out on consummateathlete.com later this week, sort of with my feelings on whether or not, like, what does a VO2 max test look like, just my kind of experience with it, but then also, like, who do I think it makes sense for? And I wanted to like put this out there, like, because VO2 max is related to, like, is largely influenced by your genetics, not entirely, like, you can do quite a bit to change it, but there is a genetic component. I do think if you're someone who has, like, a very fixed mindset, if you're someone who, believes that you're, kind of, it is what it is, you can't change things, whatever, this is maybe not a metric that you should really look at that often, because I think you can get really in your head with it and kind of like be like, oh, mine's 40. I'm never going to be, I'm never going to have this basic fitness of having my VO2 in the 70s and 80s, like Glassford says here. I don't know if that's my
base fitness, but this is, I guess, the thing with VO2. So I've never, this is why when we talk about lab testing, lactate and VO2, I struggle with, again, we know lots of people who are very smart people, and I think you should go work with those people simply because they're smart people, and you will learn a lot and you will do good because of that. But I am suspect of testing per se for most people, because I'm not sure, you sort of get back to like, but then we're going to do the normal training that you would do anyhow. Like, what is the specific thing? And are we so positive that when we do it, it's going to change the thing or change the performance versus, we train mostly easy. We do some intervals, I don't know. We're specific to the discipline. It sort of gets back to that why even. But now with this longevity thing where they're saying, the higher your VO2 max is, the longer, this is a metric of longevity. I think you could probably track the same thing by doing like a 5-minute hill test, and that gets to the MAP question we're going to talk about too. But, I just don't know what you're going to really do with it.
I think as long as you're willing to make it motivational rather than upsetting, it's not a bad thing. I would say, like, I was actually super nervous doing the test, because I was sort of like, oh, shoot, if mine is, like, pretty low, like, how am I going to feel about that? And, what am I going to do with that? And before I went in, I, like, really did kind of reflect on it and, like, come to terms with, like, okay, if it's low, that's fine. That's room for improvement, with intensity. Like, I can work on that. You can increase your VO2 max. Great. It's just information.
And even that sentence you just said, like, that was very contentious. When I went to school, it was very much like, this is set, it doesn't really change more than like a couple percent. And then I think we've now opened up that it can change a fair bit.
Yeah. And I mean, you've cited a couple times, I think on the podcast, we've talked about, like, there's the guy who set the record on the track at like 95 years old or something, that like raised his VO2 max at 90.
No, I think he was, now you're confusing me, but I think he was 100.
He might have been. Yeah,
it's the Balat study anyhow, and he was older than most track cyclists, we'll say this, and I think they increased it. What was it, like his VO2 max again, because he was older, it was lower, but I think it went up 10%, because I think it was like 30 to 33 milliliters of oxygen, and they sort of like worked on his cadence, like so he could pedal faster, and he just trained, and then he set the world record for his age group, and then but like also it showed that like even as we get older, which this like horror story is like it goes down as you get older, but I always push back that like, but what if you train more than you did, or like, you know, in a different way or whatever, and like it obviously can go up. The human body still adapts even though you're getting older, but like yes, there are things that happen as we age.
Yeah, I mean, look, we like Peter Attia, we like his work, but I do think a lot of it has gotten blown out of proportion where now VO2 max is the only metric of longevity, and it's only going to go down as you age, and zone 2 is the only kind of training you should do forever if you want to age.
I think he talks about VO2 max training too. But that's I think the idea, right? And so it is, you know, what could we correspond with? So you could also track a power. So when you do these tests, usually they give you like the peak minute, which there's different terms for this, but I would probably just call it the maximal aerobic power. And then this is, you know, maybe the peak minute that you get from this. When Molly was running, it would be either the peak power from the running or probably the peak pace. So this would be like your pace at VO2 max, you could call it, or power at VO2 max. So for a minute, you're running this fast.
Oh, see, I didn't get that because we actually did incline rather than increasing the speed. Yeah. So mine just ended up with heart rate zones, like no kind of power or pace, which honestly I prefer, because when you're and the reason we did it that way is because trail running, ultra running, you're so rarely going to be on that flat rail trail, so the paces kind of don't really
and the money's
help.
Made maybe on the climb, and then you know, probably that's like a safety piece too. They don't want people running super fast in the lab.
Still think this guy was like really perplexed because he expected just like a normal reporter, not me showing up.
So you might get something like this from, you know, some of the FTP tests that, like, I think how Zwift does it, and some of these others, they do a ramp test. So it goes a little harder and a little harder and a little harder. And then at the end of it, you get like a peak 1 minute. And then they usually take 75% of that, I think, to get your FTP, which is a little confusing, but you could take that value. The other thing that I like to do is sort of 5 or 6 minute power tests, and you could just track that as well. Not that it's the exact same, but it sort of gives you this idea of this middle, you know, sort of this hard intensity that you can hold for an extended period. So you could track that power. And again, this is essentially what the watches are doing, is they're looking at how fast you're moving at different paces over different terrain using the GPS. What's the heart rate response? And then they're giving you a VO2 max estimate. You could do a more direct measurement of performance by just saying, how fast can I run a 5K? How fast or how far or how many watts can I put out for 5 minutes? And then go forth in your life and just watch that. Now, of course, as you get older, that's probably not going to be as high, but you could set the challenge to keep pushing that, right? And there's lots of things with running. There's age-graded results. I recall we talked about that way back. But for things like marathon times, right, as you get into different age decades, they sort of have like a graded, like if you did a 3-hour marathon like Lance Armstrong when you were 30, then when you're 40, you can do like a 3:10 or something like that, and they sort of scale down, and that a lot of people find that those are helpful setting goals as you get older too.
Love it. Okay, did you want to talk about MAP?
That was the maximal aerobic power. Oh, okay. So that's sort of like that 1 minute idea from a ramp test. So not just 1 minute time trial, but the 1 minute from one of these tests where you're doing. So this is like that power at VO2 or something. That's how I think about it anyhow. I'm sure there's mistakes I've made in that assumption, but that's the idea. Okay,
perfect. All right, let's move on to Garmin metrics. We've joked about it in this episode, in past episodes. If you have a Garmin watch or computer, you have almost certainly seen your watch pop up that you have been productive, unproductive.
You've never been productive.
Never been productive. Yeah. That doesn't actually exist in there.
So
training.
Before we get into them, and I don't think we'll do all of these because there's so many, but I think you've spoken directly to the Garmin engineers who have created this, and they said,
don't worry about it.
Well, they you know, again, they're assuming like an optimal in a vacuum. These things generally do work. So someone who has a Garmin watch that they're wearing and sleeping with,
that is doing heart rate while you're doing that,
and you're training regularly with it, and you're collecting the data, probably this is going to be fairly useful. The further you get away from that, the more troublesome it's going to be on all of these, the VO2 max estimates, the body battery, the training status, the training, which is the other one there?
Productivity. Just going to keep saying productivity.
Okay, there's things there that you can read. So what these watches then are doing is they're sort of going through and they're trying to give you, based on what you did today and what you've done. Again, this is related similar to the fitness score or the chronic load. The Garmin watches are also going through and saying, like, what is your training status? And then what is the word we're looking for there? Training effect. Training effect. So the training effect is the single workout, I think. And then the training status is related to the more chronic. And I believe it's like 4 weeks. So the training status, is that what it says? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so that's like a period. And then it's really, it wants to know things like, in the last 4 weeks, what has your training load been like? That's what it's trying to estimate based on what it knows. Now, if you've been recording on all different devices, you've been Zwifting, and then, going outside with your watch and running, you're mixing sports, you're mixing devices, and that watch probably doesn't know everything about you.
Yeah, so training status, for example, is based on changes in VO2 max, acute load, so what you did that day, and HRV status. So if you haven't been sleeping with the watch, you have no HRV status.
Right, because the Garmin watch will record HRV, which we haven't spoke about yet, but the HRV is, or did we speak about? I guess we sort of mentioned it.
If you're not doing heart rate, you don't have a VO2 estimate.
Right.
So all it can base on is acute load.
Now, what would be better is if it just said not enough data, but it sort of jumps in there very quickly and starts giving you these ratings. And so usually what you'll see is like detraining and productive or unproductive in there, right? And then it'll sometimes say things like your aerobic training effect and the anaerobic training effect.
See, it's weird because it does say that it should tell you no status and that it's insufficient data, but for some reason, mine has just decided that I am detraining.
A lot of them will jump in pretty quickly. And Marco, again, from HRV for Training, he talks a bit about this where they want to get you something. So it's, even day one, they might give you like your HRV trend, but it's one day or 3 days in, and it's like, this is your normal range, but those are only 3 days. It doesn't know your normal range based off of 3 days of data. But it wants you to start using it and following it, right? So it is like how you get people going with the system. Like, I've been using HRV for Training, I think it might be almost 10 years. Like, I have a lot of data in there, right? So, and I'm pretty consistent with it. So I do think that that's useful, but this is where these things, you want to be careful that you're collecting all of this data. So again, the body battery is even one that now will sync into Training Peaks. And it's one that the battery is based on your sleep quality. And then again, it's calculating or estimating things like HRV and this off of the watch. So if you don't have a watch that records this stuff, which I don't, I have a run watch from Garmin, but it doesn't record heart rate off my wrist, so I don't have those, right? But I'm still presented with things like battery and the training effect and this sort of stuff.
Yeah, so don't take it too seriously. It's okay if it tells you you're unproductive. Mm-hmm. It's fine.
And remember, I mean, that productivity is one that people will bring up a lot. And I do find that when I'm consistently training, which means with that device, it does sort of start coming in where it's less insulting, I'll say. But I don't know that it's always very usable. But it does it will switch over to things like maintaining and productive.
It's so funny because if they had just done away with productive and unproductive as like their terms and had just come up with more like less hurtful terms, mm-hmm. Or triggering terms, mm-hmm. I feel like no one would care about this, but because they chose productive as their word, people, including myself, are just up in arms.
Sure. And so there's another one. What's there, Molly, if you can find too? There's one where you're like, when you're starting out training, is it status? There's one like when you're starting out training status. Is that one or no?
Training readiness?
Readiness. I think that's the one. So when you're starting out on a workout, usually about a mile in or something like that, it will give you like a green or red sort of, you're tired or you're not tired. And it's sort of this like status.
Oh, that's performance condition. Sorry, not training readiness.
Oh, okay.
Training readiness will tell you in the morning based on your HRV and your sleep.
So maybe you get,
if you're good to go. So that'll also be like a green red, but the performance condition will tell you during the activity where
that's
you're at. That's
the one I meant. And so that's one that's sort of interesting. And I find it's like, okay, you need to remember that it doesn't have things like muscular soreness are not expressed by HRV or any of these things. But that's one that I do find sometimes when maybe I've done a double day. So in the morning I did intervals, and then maybe I'm doing like an easy workout in the afternoon. Sometimes I'll see that it's different or it's saying like lower status, and that doesn't mean I stop running and go home and sleep. It just means that you might be tired and or your heart rate is higher, HRV might be lower, and so that then your training status isn't as high because of these things. Now, it doesn't know how you're going to really do it. Just saying your heart rate seems higher relative to the pace that we think you're going. Now, the pace could be slower because you're trudging through snow or, it's muddy or something like that, right? It doesn't always know some of these other things. So there's obviously a lot of variables, but I would say that that's one that generally it says good. It's like around, 0 to 2, positive 2. And then if I do have like these situations where I'm maybe tired or like more activated even because it's a double workout or something like that, then I sometimes will see like -2. And again, I usually just proceed with the plan because the plan was an easy second run or something like that, right? And so that's where, again, Marco is very good at talking about just because the HRV is low doesn't mean you change everything based on a day. We want to look at the trends over time. And if like every day is trending downward, then that's information. But what you might adjust is the intensity or the duration if there is like an obvious like I feel like crap and the HRV is lower, right? Which is they're trying to present here in this readiness or whatever status.
Perfect. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps up the Garmin and Training Peaks, key numbers. If there are any other numbers that you want us to kind of dig into, I'll say debunk, maybe it's Strava, Zwift, whatever, more than happy to do that. Just hit us up over, again, consummateathlete.com contact page or DM us at Consummate Athlete. And of course, quick thank you to our sponsor at Payable Apps. So if you do want technology that works for you and gets it right every time.
Most of the time.
Provided you've done it right. All the time, I'm going to say. Honestly, Payable Apps, greatest way to be able to very quickly create a payment page, whether you're doing in-person stuff or online stuff. You can basically make a Google form into a payment page. Super slick, super easy. Using stuff you already have, so it's much simpler than trying to have to sign up for some kind of new software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've helped a few other coaches sort of get, you can do subscriptions even. So, if someone was signing up for coaching, they could sign up for a monthly payment, and extrapolate that to whatever business you're doing, where maybe someone pays on a monthly or in installments. You can do 4, payments or something like that. It's really very flexible. We've used it for jersey orders. We've used it for, what else did we use it for?
In-person sales. I was actually going to say, you just signed up for homegrown gravel down in Atlanta, Georgia at the end of February, and I'll be there doing some Strong Girl publishing sales. And when I'm there, it's actually what I use as my sort of point of sale. Because people can either do it on the iPad we have there, or they can just scan the QR code and boom, go to the site quickly, pay for their books, pay for their Read Books, Ride Bikes tote bag, and boom, they're done. So super easy. It's been really convenient for in-person stuff where I don't really feel like, putting all the money into having like a full-on Square terminal because we don't do them that often. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So check that out, payableapps.com. We have a link in the show notes with kind of all of our favorite templates. A good friend of ours is the designer behind it, so we also helped create a lot of the templates, which means for the cyclists out there, they're really nerdy and bike themed. All right, with that said, hit us up with questions, and thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next week. Happy training. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.